Hello everyone, welcome to another video. In this one we're going over the Reaper weapons in Dark Souls 2. And we're gonna start off with one that doesn't exactly play like a Reaper type of weapon. Technically this weapon should have been in the Axe class, but it is what it is. This is the Silverback Sickle. It's a bit rare, you can get it in the Undead Crypt by the enemies that wield it. Very close to Agdane. Basically this weapon does dark damage and it has pretty much exactly the same moveset as a Bandit Axe. However, I have done tests on this and it is not as good as a Battle Axe or a Bandit Axe at doing damage, even if you infuse it and buff it with Dark and do all the things like that. So it weighs 4 units, it has 20 poise break, which is less than the Axes, that's about the same as a longsword type of weapon. 110 counter damage and a 50 strength and dex. With a Ring of Blades, it does 488 damage. You have to keep in mind that some of that damage is split damage though. But yeah, I mean this weapon I did not cover in the axe video, so I wanted to cover it here. However, you can pretty much just think of it as an axe. And if you were to infuse the battle axe or the bandit axe with dark and then buff it with dark, I'm pretty sure they would do more damage than this thing, kind of making it useless in my opinion. Next up, the Great Scythe. This is actually a Reaper type of weapon that plays more like a Reaper type of weapon you would expect. It is dropped by the spiders in Brightstone Cove Saldora. It can be pretty rare to get it that way, and it's also sold by Tichigrin. Probably easier to buy it from Tichigrin, the guy in the Undead Purgatory. Weighs 5 units, has 15 poise break, 110 counter damage, and a 50 strength and dex. It is 423. These Reaper type of weapons have a very strict sweet spot, similar to the way halberds work. Now the Reapers are a little bit lighter than halberds, and I would argue slightly quicker as well, depending on what kind of combos you're doing with them. So they're lighter than halberds, they're quicker than halberds, but they do a little bit less damage and they definitely do less backstab and parry damage and stuff like that than the halberds. I like to compare these weapons to the halberd because they have pretty similar reach and obviously the sweet spot system. Oh, they also have less stagger potential than halberds do as well. I think that using these weapons in a fight is extremely difficult because of that sweet spot, and you won't always stagger the enemies like you will with a halberd, because sometimes when you miss with a halberd you can still stagger the enemy because of the poise break. That's not necessarily the case with this one, and when you don't hit with that sweet spot, you do like 50-60% less damage. It's quite ridiculous. Anyways, this scythe scales with dexterity, so it's a little bit more dex heavy. It gets an A scaling in dexterity, but it is overall pretty basic, pretty standard scythe type of weapon. Next up, the Great Machete. You can get this from the Gowlers in the Lost Bestie. I thought those guys were called jailers, but okay. Gowlers, I guess the Wikipedia calls them. It's those big guys with the cape. This one weighs 6 units, it has 15 poise break as well, 110 counter damage and a 50 strength and dex, 428, so only slightly more than the Great Scythe. Maybe this one looks like it would have a little bit of a better sweet spot than the Great Scythe, because the blade is slightly bigger. Their movesets is a little bit different. The two-handed moveset is pretty decent for crowd control, since it does like sweeping attacks. This one gets a B scaling in strength. Alright, next up let's look at one that is pretty interesting. This one is the Full Moon Sickle. You can get it from the big guys in Harvest Valley that wield them. And this is one of the best bleed weapons in the game. As a matter of fact, if you infuse both of them with bleed, you get 230 base damage, as well as, with my stats, I have an additional 202 on the bleed scaling. So power stancing these things, you can pretty much bleed almost every enemy in the game in a single power stance attack. I was also wearing the Shadow Gauntlets, but I don't have the Crest of Blood. Yeah, these ones are pretty decent if you want to use it in that sense. Bleed is not really that special in PvE though. But you know, it's one of the best. I think this one and the Forlorn Sword are the best bleed weapons in the game if you want to do some sick bleed damage. They don't have very good scaling, gets an E in strength, a C in dexterity, so it's not much there. They have at least 20 poise break, they weigh 8 units, 110 counter damage, and when you have them infused with bleed at 50 strength and dex, they do 364 damage. I don't really know if you would use these things in any other way than to do bleed damage. Maybe you can just use them as a troll weapon, because if you want to do more physical damage with them, sure, not infusing them with bleed is better, but it's not really going to be, you know, a significantly better weapon than something else that you could potentially use. Anyways, it is a pretty rare drop, and for me to get 2 of them took me like an hour of farming, and I'm in New Game Plus 3. Next up, the Crescent Sickle. This one is a pretty rare one to get. You have to either get to rank 2 of the Dark Brotherhood of Blood, or it can be sold by Chancellor Warliger in New Game Plus 2. This is the way that I got it. This is the scythe that kind of does magic damage. It weighs 8 units, so it's quite heavy. 15 poise break, 110 counter damage, and at 50 strength and dex, it does 505 in terms of damage. Lots of sweeping attacks with this weapon. It does have the sweet spot as well though. But yeah, if you are an intelligence build, maybe it could be pretty decent. It gets a C scaling in intelligence, C in dexterity, and an E in strength. Pretty basic scythe in terms of what it does. It's just the one that kind of does magic damage, I guess, if that's what you want to get. It's very difficult to get though. It's a bit ridiculous that it's so hard to get, and you don't really get that much from it, you know. So next one is the Scythe of Nar Alma. This one, unfortunately, you have to kill Tichigren, so maybe you should do this before going into your next New Game Plus. This is the only way to get it, and then buying it from Malintia. This one is the one that does dark damage. It weighs 5 units, 15 poise, 110 counter damage, and at 50 strength and dex, it does 466 damage. So a little bit less than the previous one that we looked at, but it's also 3 units lighter. The Scythe of Nar Alma scales best with dexterity, gets a B scaling in dexterity, and it takes 12 int and 12 faith in order to be able to use it as well. Again, man, nothing super special. If you want to use a scythe that does dark damage, you can. At the end of the video, I may conclude what I think about these scythes, because, I mean, the short of it is, I don't think they're very useful. They're sort of an in-between weapon, kind of like similar to halberds, but not quite there, you know what I mean? And halberds, in my opinion, are not really that good to use in the first place. So you can look pretty cool with them. Maybe you can get some cool and sick looking builds in PvP, but if you want to take it seriously, I don't think that scythes are very competitive. However, pretty much one of the better scythes that you can get is the Bone Scythe. You get this one from the Covetous Demon Soul, trading it with Strayed. This one doesn't have a lot of durability at only 40. It is a pure strength scythe. It weighs 10 units, 15 poise break, 110 counter damage, and at 50 strength and dex, it does 526. Now this thing does have the sweet spot system, but that is competing with halberds. Like, finally you have a scythe that is sort of competing with halberds. However, I do think it has a little bit lower counter damage than the average of halberds. This one has 110, halberds has 120. Also, it has the shortest reach in class, or one of the shortest reach in class. But it's at least somewhat decent if you know, using scythe is essentially what you want to do. It's pure strength. When I have 50 strength, it has no scaling in anything else, only an A scaling in strength. Does take quite high stats to use, 28 strength and 20 dex, and it doesn't even scale with dex. At least something good comes out of that boss though. Alright, so next up, the Scythe of Want. This one you get from the Chandra Soul. There are a lot of things you can get from the Chandra Souls, I believe 3 or 4 weapons. This is one of them. This one is a dark scythe, but it cannot be infused or buffed. It weighs 12 units, 15 poise break, 110 counter damage, and at 50 strength and dex, as well as I actually have 26 int and faith. It does 669 damage. So a lot of damage, but it is split. So, and you cannot buff and infuse these things, so it's not gonna really be doing that much. Even if, yeah, if the boss is weak to dark, perhaps. I do think that this is one of the better scythes as well, and it's not a horrible weapon to pick and get with Chandra Soul. The stats to wield this scythe are quite high. You need 18 faith and 18 intelligence, 20 dexterity, and 14 strength. It gets a B scaling in dexterity, no scaling in any of the elemental stats. The moveset is pretty similar to what you would expect from a scythe. Next up is the Scythe of the Forlorn. You can get this from Strayed after killing the Forlorn enemy that wields it. You will have had to fight 4 Forlorns before getting this scythe, however. Or maybe even 5. No, this is the final weapon, so you have to fight 5 Forlorns, and then you actually have to find the one that's wielding the scythe, defeat him, and that's when the scythe will appear in Strayd's inventory. Similar to the Great Sword of the Forlorn, this one you have to be fully hollowed for the scythe to be as effective as possible. It weighs 11 units, has 15 poise break, 110 counter damage, 140 bleed, 70 dark, but at 50 strength and dex, it does 499 damage. I tried infusing this with either dark or bleed. It does drop the damage down significantly, even when you try to infuse it with dark, so I would actually recommend keeping it uninfused, or maybe infusing it with bleed if that's something that you want to do. This weapon, as well as the Scythe of Want, has a double hit, which you can bleed enemies pretty quickly if you decide to infuse it with bleed. Buff it with something just for some extra damage, and then do the R1 and then an R2 followed by that. This is another one of the better bleed weapons in the game. If you want to use this in PvE, you probably need to use the Ring of Binding so that your health, instead of being at 50%, goes at least up to 75%. But yeah, it's a pretty big issue to have your health quartered down and you are dependent on a ring to keep it a little bit higher. I don't think this is the case when you fight in Dark Brotherhood of Blood, however. You can be fully hollowed and you'll still spawn with 100% health. So this is something that you can use in that sense if you want to. But scythes are quite difficult to use as a weapon. So yeah, man, this is pretty much it. These are cool weapons for sure. I wouldn't really say that they are anything that you should take very, very seriously when you're trying to try hard in this game. Using Scythe isn't necessarily your best option. So yeah, that was all for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.